The avoidant navigates relationships with defended structure that prevents them from recognizing genuine love while it is being offered, that interprets others' investment as pressure rather than as gift, that experiences care and patience as obligations that threaten their autonomy rather than as expressions of authentic caring that could nourish them. This defensive filtering means the avoidant cannot adequately receive or value love when someone truly offers it, cannot distinguish between others, conditional acceptance, and the rare unconditional acceptance that sees their defended self without requiring immediate transformation, cannot recognize when someone loves them, not despite their limitations, but with clear-eyed understanding of those limitations combined with genuine care for the wounded human beneath the defended exterior. You offered this authentic love, not the fantasy love that exists only when someone performs perfectly, not the conditional love that withdraws when patterns disappoint, but the real love that sees someone's limitations and fears and wounds and chooses to remain present anyway. That provides patience and understanding while maintaining boundaries and self-respect, that accepts the avoidant as they are while refusing to enable patterns that harm both parties. The avoidant experienced your love throughout the relationship, yet their defensive structure prevented them from recognizing it as love, caused them to interpret your patience as weakness, your understanding as permission to continue their patterns without consequences, your acceptance as evidence you would tolerate anything rather than recognizing it as remarkable capacity to see beneath their defenses, to the human struggling with profound fear of intimacy. The avoidant pushed away or withdrew from exactly what their defended self most needed, but their conscious mind could not acknowledge wanting. Then time passes. The avoidant encounters others who cannot provide what you provided, who lack your specific capacity to hold space for someone defended without trying to fix them, who respond to the avoidance patterns with the frustration or abandonment that confirms the avoidance defended beliefs rather than with the steady presence that challenge those beliefs. The avoidant discovers that what they took as common offerings, your patience, your understanding, your capacity to remain steady, were actually rare gifts that most people cannot or will not provide. Slowly, through accumulated loss and failed connections and persistent awareness of your absence, the avoidant begins recognizing that you loved them in ways they have never been loved before or since, that your love was real while their defenses prevented them from receiving it, that they lost someone who saw them clearly and chose them anyway. This recognition arrives too late, after you have released them, after you have moved beyond waiting for them to develop capacity to receive what you offered. The avoidant must sit with devastating awareness that they were genuinely loved by someone remarkable, and their defensive structure prevented them from recognizing or reciprocating that love until the person offering it had exhausted themselves and chosen their own well-being, over-hoping for the avoidant's transformation. They miss you through the absence of unconditional acceptance. The avoidant moves through relationships encountering two primary responses to their defended patterns. Others either attempt to fix them, approaching their defensive structure as problem requiring solution, or others reject them, deciding that the avoidant's emotional unavailability makes them unsuitable for relationship. Both responses confirm the avoidant's defended beliefs about intimacy, that being truly known leads to being changed or being abandoned, that authentic self-revelation results in others attempting to modify them, or in others concluding they are fundamentally flawed. These responses reinforce the avoidance defensive structure by validating the fear that drove its formation, that who they are beneath their defenses is unacceptable and must either be hidden or be transformed to merit others' continued presence. You responded to the avoidance defended patterns in an entirely different way that the avoidant only recognizes as unusual after encountering many people who lack your capacity. You saw the avoidance defensive structure clearly, recognized their emotional unavailability and their patterns of withdrawal, understood that their defended position stemmed from wounds and fears rather than from malice or indifference. Yet you did not respond to this seeing by attempting to fix them, did not approach their defensive structure as project requiring your intervention, did not position yourself as healer who would rescue them from their patterns. You also did not respond by rejecting them, did not conclude that their limitations made them unworthy of connection, did not abandon them when their patterns proved difficult to navigate. Instead, you offered something far more rare and psychologically sophisticated: acceptance of who they were in their defended state, combined with clear boundaries about what you could tolerate and what you needed from relationship. You saw their limitations without making those limitations into crises requiring immediate resolution. You understood their fears without positioning yourself as person who would eliminate those fears through your healing presence. You recognized their wounds without taking responsibility for bandaging those wounds. This acceptance communicated profound message the avoidance defensive structure had never encountered. You are acceptable as you are, and simultaneously, I will not harm myself by accepting treatment your patterns create. This unconditional acceptance that did not require the avoidant to change immediately to merit your presence, yet also did not enable their patterns indefinitely, created psychological safety the avoidant had never experienced in intimate relationship. The avoidant could be authentically defended without facing immediate pressure to transform, could reveal their limitations without triggering your attempts to fix them, could demonstrate their patterns without you either pathologizing those patterns or accepting them without boundaries. This combination of seeing them clearly and accepting what you saw while maintaining self-respect created conditions where the avoidant could occasionally lower their defenses precisely because you were not demanding that they do so. The avoidant took this unconditional acceptance completely for granted while receiving it. They interpreted your acceptance as evidence that their patterns were not actually problematic, that their defensive structure was justified, that they did not need to examine or modify their approach to intimacy because you remained present despite their limitations. The avoidant failed to recognize that your acceptance was extraordinary gift rather than baseline standard, that most people cannot or will not maintain presence with someone as defended as the avoidant consistently demonstrated themselves to be, that your capacity to accept them while maintaining boundaries reflected sophisticated psychological awareness rather than absence of standards. After losing you, the avoidant encounters person after person who responds to their defensive patterns with the fixing or rejecting responses the avoidant anticipated all along. New partners express frustration with the avoidant's emotional unavailability, communicate that the avoidant needs to change if the relationship is to continue, approach the avoidance patterns as obstacles to be overcome rather than as expressions of fear to be understood. Or new partners decide relatively quickly that the avoidance limitations make them unsuitable for relationship, that the emotional unavailability is not worth tolerating, that the avoidance defensive structure creates more pain than the connection provides pleasure. Both responses feel familiar to the avoidant. They confirm the defended beliefs about intimacy that organize the avoidance defensive structure. Yet both responses also highlight through their contrast what you provided that no one else has provided before or since. The avoidant misses you specifically through the absence of the unconditional acceptance you offered. They miss being able to be authentically defended without facing immediate pressure to transform. They miss the psychological safety of being seen clearly without being pathologized or fixed. They miss the rare experience of someone understanding their limitations without making those limitations into project requiring intervention. They miss the combination of acceptance and boundaries that allowed them to remain themselves while also being gently confronted with the consequences of remaining themselves. The avoidant recognizes too late that you offered something profoundly rare. You loved them as they were while refusing to enable patterns that harmed both of you, saw their defended self with compassion while maintaining self-respect that prevented your acceptance from becoming self-abandonment. This recognition that your acceptance was unconditional, not in the sense that you would tolerate anything indefinitely, but in the sense that you did not require them to change before you could see their worth, arrives after the avoidant has lost access to that acceptance. The avoidant faces that they had someone who genuinely accepted their defended self, who saw beneath their patterns to the wounded human trying to protect themselves, who offered presence without pressure and boundaries without rejection. This combination of qualities that you embodied now reveals itself as rare rather than common, as gift rather than baseline, as something the avoidant will likely never find replicated, because most people lack the psychological sophistication to accept someone's defended position while simultaneously maintaining clear boundaries about what that defended position costs. Understanding how the avoidant misses you through absence of unconditional acceptance requires recognizing that the avoidant's defensive structure organized specifically around preventing others from truly seeing them because being seen has historically led to being changed or being abandoned. You disrupted this defensive expectation by seeing them clearly and responding with neither fixing nor rejection, but rather with acceptance that honored their autonomy while protecting your own well-being. The avoidance defensive structure had no practice mechanisms for managing this response, creating brief windows where they could be authentic without immediately defensive. The loss of your unconditional acceptance means the loss of the only relational space where the avoidant could occasionally be themselves without their defenses while feeling safe from the pressure to transform or the threat of abandonment. They miss you through the safety they took for granted. The avoidant operates with highly sensitive threat detection system that constantly scans relational environment for signs of danger, pressure to be more emotionally available, expectation to provide consistency they doubt they can sustain, judgment about their patterns, withdrawal of others' acceptance when their limitations become visible. This hypervigilant defensive scanning means the avoidant experiences most relationships as moderately threatening most of the time, requiring ongoing defensive management to ensure they do not become too vulnerable, too exposed, too dependent on connection that could be withdrawn. The avoidant lives in persistent state of guarded caution in intimate relationships, never fully relaxing because relaxation would mean lowering defenses that protect against the threats their nervous system continuously anticipates. You created relational environment that operated as exception to this defensive hypervigilance. Through your consistent behavior across time, you demonstrated that you would not pressure the avoidant to be more available than their capacity allowed, that you could tolerate their withdrawal without becoming destabilized or punishing, that you would not judge their patterns harshly, but rather would seek to understand the fear and wounds driving those patterns. You showed through sustained action, rather than through words alone, that the avoidant was safe with you. Safe to be defended when they needed to be. Safe to occasionally be vulnerable when they felt capable. Safe to fluctuate between presence and distance without facing the abandonment or engulfment their defensive structure organized around preventing. This safety you created operated largely beneath the avoidant's conscious awareness. The avoidant did not think explicitly, "I feel safe with this person," but rather experienced your presence as somehow less threatening than others' presence, noticed that their defensive hypervigilance could relax slightly when with you, recognized at some unconscious level that you were different from the people whose responses confirmed their defended fears. The safety manifested in small ways. The avoidant barely registered. They could share thoughts without extensive pre-editing to avoid triggering your emotional response, could express needs without fear. You would use those needs to create obligations, could withdraw when overwhelmed without you interpreting withdrawal as personal rejection requiring defensive response of your own. The specific quality of safety you created involved predictability that the avoidance nervous system desperately needed but could not articulate wanting. You developed consistent way of responding to the avoidance patterns, giving space when they withdrew while remaining steady in your own center, expressing your needs clearly without making those needs into crisis requiring immediate resolution, maintaining your boundaries without punishing the avoidant for triggering those boundaries. This predictability meant the avoidant could anticipate your responses, could develop trust that you would not suddenly shift into behaviors that threatened their defended position, could relax their hypervigilance slightly, because your consistency created foundation of safety beneath the relationship's fluctuations. You also created safety by never weaponizing the avoidant's vulnerabilities against them. When the avoidant occasionally lowered their defenses enough to share fears or wounds or authentic feelings, you received those vulnerable moments with care that demonstrated you would not use that information to manipulate them, would not reference their vulnerabilities during conflict to wound them, would not hold their moments of openness against them later when they returned to defended position. This trustworthy response to vulnerability created safety that allowed the avoidant to risk occasional openness precisely because you proved through consistent behavior that being vulnerable with you did not lead to the exploitation or abandonment their defensive structure existed to prevent. The avoidant took all this safety completely for granted, failing to recognize that the consistent, calm presence you maintained, the predictable responses you offered, the trustworthy handling of their vulnerabilities represented considerable emotional labor and psychological sophistication. The avoidant assumed that what you provided was baseline that anyone would offer, that the safety they felt with you was common experience they could find elsewhere, that your capacity to create secure base from which they could venture into occasional vulnerability was standard rather than exceptional. The avoidant did not recognize that most people cannot maintain the steady presence you demonstrated, cannot tolerate the avoidant's withdrawal without becoming dysregulated, cannot create the predictability that the avoidant's nervous system required to occasionally relax its defensive vigilance. After losing you, the avoidant enters new connections and immediately notices that their defensive hypervigilance cannot relax in ways it occasionally relaxed with you. New partners become hurt or angry when the avoidant withdraws, creating exactly the destabilizing emotional intensity the avoidant's defenses exist to manage. New partners demonstrate unpredictability in their responses, preventing the avoidant from developing trust that would allow any lowering of defenses. New partners use the avoidant's rare moments of vulnerability as leverage in later conflicts, confirming the avoidant's defended belief that being vulnerable leads to exploitation. The avoidant discovers that the relational environment with new people requires constant defensive management, that they cannot relax their hypervigilance even slightly, that the safety they occasionally felt with you does not replicate in connections with people who lack your specific capacity to create secure space. The avoidant misses you through the persistent awareness that their nervous system could occasionally rest with you in ways it cannot rest with anyone else. They miss the specific quality of safety where they could be defended without facing pressure to immediately transform, yet could also be occasionally vulnerable without facing exploitation of that vulnerability. They miss the predictability that allowed them to anticipate your responses and trust that you would not suddenly shift into behaviors that threatened their defended position. They miss being able to share authentic thoughts and feelings without extensive defensive filtering, because you had proven through sustained behavior that you would receive their authenticity with care rather than using it against them. Understanding how the avoidant misses you through the safety they took for granted requires recognizing that the avoidant's defensive structure makes genuine relational safety extraordinarily rare in their experience. Most people respond to the avoidance patterns in ways that confirm the avoidant's defended beliefs about intimacy being threatening. You responded in ways that challenged those beliefs by creating an environment where the avoidant could occasionally lower defenses without facing the consequences their defensive structure anticipated. This safety was invisible to the avoidant while they experienced it. It felt like absence of threat rather than like positive presence of security. Yet its absence after losing you creates persistent discomfort that forces recognition of what you provided that no one else has provided before or since. They miss you through failed attempts to receive love from others. The avoidant encounters people after you who express interest, who demonstrate care, who offer investment in building connection. These new people say they want relationship, communicate their feelings, make efforts to create intimacy. Yet the avoidant discovers that their defensive structure prevents them from receiving what these people offer in ways that create familiar pattern. The avoidant's defenses activate when others move toward them with emotional availability. Their nervous system interprets others' investment as pressure. Their patterns of withdrawal emerge automatically to create the distance their defensive structure requires. The avoidant watches themselves repeat the same defended responses that destroyed the relationship with you, observes their patterns pushing away people who express genuine interest, recognizes that their defensive structure operates independent of who offers love or how carefully they offer it. Yet, simultaneously, with recognizing that their patterns repeat across new connections, the avoidant also notices something different about how they experience these new people's love compared to how they experienced yours. The new people's care feels somehow less genuine. Their investment appears more conditional. Their presence carries quality that suggests they are evaluating the avoidant rather than accepting them. The avoidant's defensive structure finds material in these new people's expressions of love that confirms defended beliefs, subtle signs that the person would withdraw their care if the avoidance patterns became too difficult, implications that the person's investment depends on the avoidant meeting certain expectations, indications that the person's acceptance is contingent on the avoidant changing, in ways that feel threatening to their defended position. This perceived difference forces the avoidant to examine the quality of love you offered compared to what others offer. The avoidant begins recognizing that your love carried different quality that their defensive structure could not weaponize in the same ways. You expressed care without that care, feeling like obligation being placed on them. You demonstrated investment without that investment, translating into pressure for them to reciprocate at levels beyond their capacity. You maintained presence without that presence, feeling like evaluation of whether they were performing adequately. Your love somehow communicated that it existed for its own sake rather than as transaction where your giving required equivalent receiving, where your presence demanded their transformation, where your care carried implicit expectations they could not meet. The avoidant particularly misses the specific quality of how you loved them during their withdrawal. When the avoidant created distance, when they retreated into defended isolation, when they became emotionally unavailable, when they demonstrated their patterns at their most pronounced. You responded in ways that new people cannot replicate. You gave space without making that space feel like punishment or abandonment. You remained steady in your own center rather than becoming destabilized by their withdrawal. You interpreted their distance as fear rather than as indifference. You maintained your care even when they could not receive it, holding space for them without demanding they occupy that space before they were capable. This quality of loving them through their defended retreat, rather than withdrawing your love when they withdrew, created safety that the avoidant only recognizes as extraordinary after encountering people whose love evaporates or becomes hostile when the avoidance patterns emerge. New people express frustration or hurt when the avoidant withdraws, making the avoidance patterns into crisis requiring immediate resolution, or into evidence that the avoidant does not truly care. This response confirms the avoidant's defended belief that their authentic defended self is unacceptable, that their patterns make them unworthy of sustained love, that others' care for them is conditional on their ability to suppress the defensive responses that feel necessary for their psychological survival. The avoidant faces in these new connections exactly what their defensive structure anticipated, that being authentically themselves in their defended state leads to others withdrawing love or demanding transformation as price of continued presence. The contrast between new people's conditional love and your unconditional love forces recognition the avoidant's defensive structure prevented during the relationship. The avoidant realizes that you love them not because they earned that love through adequate performance, but rather because you saw something in them worth loving beneath their defended exterior. You loved them when they were defended, when they withdrew, when they demonstrated their limitations at their most pronounced. Your love did not depend on their capacity to reciprocate adequately, did not require them to be other than they were, did not demand transformation as prerequisite for your continued presence. This unconditional quality of your love, not unconditional in the sense that you would tolerate anything indefinitely, but unconditional in the sense that your love existed independent of their capacity to receive it adequately, represented form of love the avoidant had never experienced before and has not encountered since. The avoidant also recognizes, through failed attempts to receive others' love, that their defensive structure specifically prevented them from receiving your love while it was available. The avoidant sees clearly now that the problem was not that you did not love them, but rather that their defenses prevented them from recognizing and receiving the love you offered. The avoidant faces that they had access to genuine unconditional love, and they rejected it through their patterns, pushed it away through their withdrawal, failed to reciprocate it through their defended limitations. This recognition generates particular form of regret because the avoidant cannot blame you for failing to love them. You loved them as fully as their defensive structure allowed them to receive, which means the loss was entirely preventable if the avoidant had possessed capacity to recognize and receive what you offered. The failed attempts to receive love from others also reveal that the avoidant is searching for replication of what you provided, that they are unconsciously comparing everyone to you and finding them lacking specifically in their capacity to love the avoidant through their defended state. The avoidant discovers they want someone who can love them the way you love them, with patience that tolerates their withdrawal, with understanding that interprets their patterns as fear rather than rejection, with steadiness that remains present even when the avoidant retreats. Yet the avoidant also recognizes that this form of love is extraordinarily rare, that what they took for granted while receiving it from you was actually exceptional capacity most people do not possess, that they are searching for someone to provide what you provided, while knowing that finding such person is unlikely given how unusual your capacity to love their defended self proved to be. Understanding how the avoidant misses you through failed attempts to receive love from others requires recognizing that the avoidant's defensive structure makes receiving love difficult under any circumstances. Yet you somehow loved them in ways that occasionally penetrated their defenses. Your love carried quality that others' love lacks: acceptance that did not require immediate transformation, presence that survived their withdrawal, care that existed for its own sake rather than as transaction demanding reciprocation. The avoidant only recognizes this exceptional quality of your love after encountering multiple people whose love feels conditional in ways yours did not, whose care depends on the avoidant's adequate performance in ways yours did not, whose presence demands reciprocation in ways yours did not. The contrast forces devastating recognition that the avoidant was genuinely loved by someone whose love they could not adequately receive while it was available. They miss you through the person they could have been with you. The avoidant carries within their defended structure a suppressed, authentic self, the person they would be if fear did not require constant defensive management, if vulnerability did not feel life-threatening, if intimacy did not activate their nervous system's alarm responses. This authentic self exists beneath the defended exterior, as potential the avoidant can occasionally glimpse during rare moments, when defenses temporarily lower, as version of themselves they suspect might emerge if conditions ever felt safe enough to allow sustained departure from defended position. Yet, across most of the avoidance relationships, this authentic self remains completely suppressed, because the relational conditions never create sufficient safety for the avoidant to risk lowering defenses enough to access who they might be without constant defensive management. You created relational conditions where this authentic self could occasionally emerge in ways the avoidant had never experienced before and has not experienced since. During the relationship's best moments, when your steady presence and unconditional acceptance created sufficient safety, when the avoidance nervous system temporarily trusted that vulnerability would not lead to exploitation or abandonment, when your consistent behavior demonstrated you would not weaponize any authentic expression they offered, the avoidant could access brief glimpses of their suppressed self. They could share genuine thoughts without defensive filtering. They could express authentic feelings without immediate need to retreat. They could demonstrate vulnerability without their nervous system immediately demanding defensive shutdown. They could imagine during these moments what life might feel like if they could sustain this less defended state.